So Nawal Mustafa is a PhD candidate in clinical neuropsychology and cognitive neuroscience researcher. She's also a mental wellness educator and provides psychoeducation in various psychological emotional concerns. Nawal's clinical interests include cognitive restructuring, psychodynamic therapy, and emotion regulation. And the topic for today is achieving emotional resilience. I'm really happy, Nawal, that you joined me because I was a little terrified to be talking about this topic alone.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the lovely introduction and really excited for today's topic. I think we can all really benefit from something like this. So super excited.
Yeah, I also believe that. And emotions is definitely one of my favorite topics. And, you know, just we were in Turkey with a bunch of colleagues last week. And I remember watching this very typical scene and commenting on it. There was a baby and, well, there were a woman having a lunch and a small toddler who was obviously getting very, very tired and troublesome. And everybody was getting irritated. And the mom said, stop it right away. Don't yell, something along the lines. And I commented to the girls to that, well, there's another trauma in the making out of the best intentions. Because I believe that from early childhood, we are very explicitly taught what not to feel and how not to feel. Yet emotions do happen, surprise, surprise. And when we don't have the parent telling us to stop being upset, stop crying, stop being tired, stop being angry, stop being sad, what's your reason to be miserable? Look, there are people who are more miserable than you. And so it goes on and on and on, and we know very well how not to feel. So how's the right way to feel? And is it even okay? Because, you know, I think Brené Brown is the person who's talking about positivity tyranny, where we insist actually that people have to be happy, have to be in a good mood, have to be pleasant to be around. Is it the right way, or are we just not good enough at reining in our emotions, or is there something wrong with this approach?
Yeah, I think you brought up a really good point where when we're growing up, I think this has just been this tradition or cultural thing where a lot of the negative emotions are, as a child, parents tell us to stop feeling the difficult feelings. So don't be sad, don't be angry, but happy and joy and pride, all those emotions are still accepted growing up. And that's why there's this whole movement of, you know, positive vibes only, or just feel positive emotions and you'll be good, because that's what we've been trained to do for so long. But when it comes to emotions, like, we're human, we are going to experience all sorts of emotions, and that's a very natural human response. And the thing is, whenever we experience something, a situation, a thought, whatever it is, the emotions come up first, and then it's up to us on how to regulate it. We have to accept the emotion as it comes up, because that is not something that's in our control. It just shows up. And then we kind of reframe our thoughts accordingly and figure out, okay, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling this way? Excuse me. So I think emotions are something that we have to accept, to just allow ourselves to feel. And the topic for today, emotional resilience, is something where it's our ability to be able to successfully adapt to difficult or challenging emotions. Because when we're happy, it's great. But what happens when we feel embarrassed? How do we react? Can we bounce back? And, you know, like, for example, a model walking on a runway and she falls. That's one of their biggest nightmares. So how can, you know, so you see the reactions, and there's so many YouTube videos on this, which is kind of sad, but the internet. So once that happens, like, are you going to get back up? Are you going to go strong and laugh it off and just walk out and make a positive thing out of it? Or are you going to sit in your thoughts and look very disappointed and not be able to bounce back, and maybe you're not going to get back on the runway? You know, so that's the resilience aspect. How do you bounce back from the difficult emotions?
So yes, I think it's good to start every conversation with a definition. So we'll definitely go to emotional resilience in a moment. But before we go into definitions, I want to ask, we talk about we need to accept emotion and we need to regulate it. So how does that, when is acceptance done? When does the regulation start? Because these are a little bit contradictory, in a way contradictory, or they sound a little bit contradictory directions, like first accept, but then regulate. What if, how much acceptance is enough and how much acceptance isn't enough? When is the right time to start regulating? How to navigate that boundary between one and the other?
Yeah, I completely understand what you mean. So acceptance really just means naming the emotions, seeing it as it is. So a lot of the times, for example, when we feel anxious or angry, we try to not even accept that we're feeling angry. It's more that I'm disappointed in you, or whatever that anger is can be defined as in a more appropriate and socially acceptable way. But if we can just accept the feeling as it comes, so, okay, I'm feeling anxious. That's me accepting it. And then I can regulate it, because you don't want to sit in that anxiety. You want to be able to work through it. If you sit in that anxiety, you're kind of frozen. You're going to do either fight, flight, or freeze response. So that is, once you accept it, you know what you are feeling. That's when you decide that, okay, now it's time to regulate it. What do I need right now to feel less anxious? How can I minimize this feeling? So that's the regulation aspect.
And I guess I guess when we're talking about acceptance of emotion, there is also this what you just said, whitewashing what you actually feel, or lying to yourself. So I guess accepting a specific emotion is not such an easy thing. We don't want to, let's say, accept sometimes guilt or shame. They're not pleasant, or anger, as you said. How do you actually know that why I'm asking this question is, let's say, if I don't accept that I'm angry, and if I from the start tell myself that, oh, I'm just disappointed, or I'm concerned for you, or anything else more acceptable, then if my regulation comes from that mistaken emotion, that I'm disappointed rather than that I'm angry, then obviously the medicine is not going to be suitable for the emotion, because I'm going to be dealing with disappointment rather than with anger, which I'm actually feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in this case, it's more about, as long as you're feeling better at the end, that's okay. So if we get too caught up in, well, maybe I'm mislabeling my emotion and it's completely deviating from what you're actually feeling, I think there's a fine balance. So if, for example, someone is feeling really guilty or shameful about something, and they say, I'm okay, I'm all right, that's a complete opposite emotion. And that's a disservice to yourself, because you're really lying to yourself. There's no one else benefiting from you recognizing and working through your emotions except you. So that is one thing. But if you're saying something like, oh, I just don't feel good right now, because you don't have the ability to really recognize and name emotions, that's a good start, because at least you recognize that something in your body doesn't feel right, something in your mind doesn't feel right. And what do you really need right now to feel better? That's the maximum. That if that's the ability that you're starting with, that's great. But something that I do with my patients is I give them an emotions wheel. So there's so many different emotions on there, and that facilitates them to really see, okay, well, I'm feeling angry, and then they go down the anger wheel. It's like, oh, it's actually me feeling betrayal by a friend, and that's why I'm angry. So that allows us to really name emotions a little bit better. And if you guys want to figure out how to get the emotions wheel, it's everywhere online. It's just this entire wheel of like 50 emotions on them.
Yes, I've seen that too, actually. Although I've seen a lot of different scales of emotions, and some of them go into as many as like 200 emotions, or even over that. Very intricate. So we announced the topic as emotional resilience, and like in any subject, I guess it's right to start with definitions. What does it mean, emotional resilience? Does it mean that you are calm as an elephant? I do not know if elephants are calm, but they look like they are. Or does it mean that you actually don't have spikes of emotion? Does it mean that you are just a regular human being who just knows how to regulate them? What is emotional resilience?
I think it's the very last one, really, if it was a very vague sort of description, but basically everyone's going to feel emotions. There's someone who doesn't feel, who's not sensitive about things isn't better than someone who is highly sensitive, because as a human being, emotions are something that is a very natural part of us. Sometimes we feel a lot and sometimes we don't feel a lot. And that really depends on how our values are, what our beliefs are, how our thoughts work. But resilience really is, how are you able to bounce back when you feel uncomfortable, difficult emotions? Really, understanding that, okay, if I am feeling anxious, or if I'm feeling angry or disappointed, these difficult feelings that we try to avoid for the most part, how can we actually bounce back from it and go through our day, being fine, rather than let that emotion take over and ruin our entire day? How can we help ourselves to get back up?
So I do still think a little bit that it's a slippery slope in a sense that once you start regulating emotions, you kind of want to avoid feeling the unpleasant stuff. I remember I was once watching this movie. I don't remember the name of the movie, in fact, but I remember the premise of it was some utopian future society where people were rid of emotions, and I think they were even medicated. I'm sure there are centers in our brain that can switch off like unpleasant things. And it was a utopian movie, and actually the point of the movie wasn't that you shouldn't feel emotions. It was probably the opposite, but I also feel that our society does strive towards complete Zen, where you kind of don't feel emotions. There were all those books. I remember I saw in the airport about, I'll replace actually the bad F word with fudge, but fudge love, fudge this, fudge that, all those feelings. Is it okay to actually strive to being calm, or that is counterproductive? To being calm and unemotional and maybe unfeeling, like not in the bad way unfeeling?
I think that is the end goal. How can we regulate ourselves to feel calm, to feel like we are okay, right? That is the end goal. But so one thing is that not all emotions need to be felt, right? Like if there is a moment where you met an acquaintance, a connection in a networking event, for example, and they said something that was kind of off and it left you feeling a little bit weird, uncomfortable. You don't have to sit with that and really try to process it, because that's going to go away and it's not really going to impact your life. But for those emotions that are going to keep coming back up because there's patterns that are happening over and over, those emotions do need to be processed. So once you name the emotion, you can then work through it to really understand, how can I minimize this uncomfortable, difficult feeling? And then from there, you go ahead and try to work through it to feel calm. That's the end goal. But a lot of the times, those emotions really need to be worked through. Otherwise, they're going to keep coming back up. And that's the entire purpose of actually working through them. Really understanding what you're feeling when, for example, if you want to set a boundary in a relationship, someone is breaking that boundary over and over for you, that leaves you feeling maybe resentful or uncomfortable. And that's not going to stop until you actually problem solve and work through that emotion. Understand, okay, this person's making me feel resentful every time they come over. What are they doing that's impacting me? And then setting that boundary so that emotion is minimized. So there's that action component as well.
Mm-hmm. So guys, I see you're leaving your questions, and I'm sure Bianca will bring someone up, not yet, maybe in another 5 minutes. But I want to ask, so what is the right way to deal with recurring unpleasant emotions, which you can't just ignore? For example, if you feel guilty as a mother, for example, a lot of women have that, or maybe guilty as a man for being busy with work and not having time for your partner, like the guilt feeling as an example. What is the right way to deal with that?
Yeah, so there's a few classic techniques for emotion regulation. And I think the number one most affordable technique is to just pause, to instead of reacting right away to that emotion. So for example, if it's guilt from a mom, there's a thought process usually that is associated with it, and it's called personalization. And this is a thought process where we try to blame ourselves for something that someone else did. So as a mom, that's very common because kids are supposed to be our responsibility, right? So if your kid does something bad at school, you might call yourself a bad mom and you might start feeling guilty. So that's a personalization aspect, because really it's not your fault that your kid acted out, and maybe your kid's going through something, right? But we automatically start to blame ourselves and feel that guilt. Now, if we're feeling it, it is important to work through it and to really understand it. You got to pause. So there's this technique called stop. It's a really great technique for emotion regulation. And basically the S is for stop for just a moment and take your time. It usually takes around 90 seconds for the emotional part of the brain to sort of start to regulate and the prefrontal cortex to start get activated again. Because when we're feeling a lot, this area of the brain that's used for reasoning and judgment, it sort of shuts down and the amygdala gets hijacked. So that's the emotional response. And this is why sometimes we say things when we're highly emotional and we don't really understand why we said that. And it could be really inconsiderate. It could be us defending ourselves for the guilt that we're feeling. Whatever it is, you have to stop and really understand what's going on. What are you feeling? So that's the S. And then T is take a breath. So just allow yourself to regulate your nervous system. We all know that deep breathing really helps us activate our rest and digest nervous response. So we want to get out of that fight and flight mode. And then the O for stop is observe your experience. So really try to understand what's going on, what's happening around you that's making you feel that way, and if what you're feeling is actually accurate. So that's the O for stop. And then P is proceed. So what is your action plan now? Is it you that was feeling triggered about something that maybe in your surrounding, it wasn't intentional, or is someone actually mistreating you? Really try to understand and then proceed accordingly. Instead of reacting right away, you want to try to respond instead.
Mm-hmm. And is this algorithm, does it work with all emotions, or let's say guilt and anger, or for example, this, I don't even know how to call this emotion, but when you're being rejected, I guess rejection, right? They feel like very different kind of emotions. Do these algorithms like change depending on what you're feeling? Because let's say if you feel guilty, you're really not probably going to go and break something or hit someone. But if you're angry, you might actually become a little violent. And the question is basically like, are there differences depending on what you're feeling?
The reaction. So if we react right away, yes, there are differences. If I'm angry, I might throw something. If I'm guilty, I might defend myself and maybe project like, no, it was actually your fault, XYZ, right? So the reactions are different. But if we use that stop technique, take a pause, really understand the situation around us and see whether what we're feeling is realistic and it makes sense, or if we got triggered, whatever that is, then that reaction, the reaction will go away. We won't be throwing things and doing things impulsively, but we will be responding to the situation. So if it's a person in front of us, we would try to communicate with them what's happening and how they're making us feel. If it's just something in our environment that causes us to get emotional, we will try to minimize that thing in our environment. But I think the reaction to the emotion, if it's impulsive, is very different. But the way we process emotions can be encompassed in that stop technique, or just allowing ourselves to process it and then moving forward.
So you did mention that you don't really need to stop for a long time or sit with emotion for a long time. Yet if we are talking about anger, let's talk about anger. Sometimes you can't just snap out of that and you still feel the emotion. And you might still want to react even if you have stopped. What do you do if you kind of made this thing and you still feel that the emotion is still there and you still want to do something?
Yeah. So anger is a very difficult emotion for a lot of us to experience. sometimes. And the response to anger is also very different. Sometimes people yell and throw things, and sometimes people freeze up and go really quiet. So it really depends on what your reaction is. But when we are experiencing anger and we decide, okay, this situation is making me angry, I'm going to take a step back and pause. That's going to help you no matter what. But sometimes we do need more time. And in that case, you can just say, hey, let's discuss this when I feel a little bit calmer. Right now, I just need some time to process things. Step away from the situation and come back once you actually have analyzed the entire situation and can approach it with a clear mind instead of letting your emotions run the conversation. And something that really helps me is just really writing down the entire scenario, and dissecting it. So figuring out, okay, what happened? Why did I start feeling angry? And is it something that the person said intentionally, or was it unintentional? Trying to answer some questions to really bring clarity to the situation and then approach it. So sometimes that 60 seconds and 90 seconds won't work. And we have to really, it's our responsibility to really understand the situation and approach with a clear mind. Otherwise, we can exacerbate the conflict a lot more than it needs to be.
But when we are trying to process it, for example, there's this one question you just suggested, that did the person say it intentionally or not? We often don't know what the other person felt. So how do you process this emotion if it's a reaction, let's say, to another person, and you don't really know their motives, you don't really understand what they're feeling? Do you need to go back into the conversation, or is it something which you can do irrespective of another person like helping you on with the processing?
Yeah, I think there's two things here. One, if we don't know what the person's intentions were and we have the opportunity to clarify that with them, that's the best way to go. But a lot of the times we can also try to figure out, if we follow the steps of the situation, we can figure out, okay, were they actually trying to be manipulative or mean, or was it more about, them not understanding how that's making me feel? Them just doing what they thought was okay, and it's actually made me feel angry. Whatever the case is, we still need to have a conversation with them if we want that relationship to still thrive. Otherwise, sometimes people make us angry and we don't want them in our life anyway, so we sort of step back and never have that conversation. And at that point, it's kind of up to you to assess, okay, was it intentional or not? But it's really a selfish thing to understand the situation yourself and see how you can move through it. If it's a relationship, though, that really matters to you, you want to have that conversation. Like, what happened there ended up making me feel really angry. I'm wondering what was going on in your mind, or what was the reason behind what you did. Having that conversation can be very, very helpful to just clarify everything and not have any resentment left over.
But it's also very scary, because very often we don't want to know what was exactly going on in that person's head, because that may be some form of I don't know, rejection towards us, like person was actually mean to you, or actually, so how do you deal with that that thing where you actually don't feel like having a conversation because you're afraid?
So what I think in this situation is, you have to have difficult conversations with people who you want to maintain relationships with, if you want that healthy relationship dynamic. It's very easy to be passive with things, very easy. It's actually, you can let go of things and kind of push them away and be like, whatever, it was nothing. And then it comes back in another pattern, and then you get even more triggered because you haven't really let go of that past situation. So having these conversations in relationships that matter to you are very, very important. So avoiding it is usually not an option unless there's that power dynamic between the two people. At that point, there has to be some sort of submissiveness. If it's, for example, a culture where in-laws are highly, highly respected, and the in-law does something that was very mean or not good, it might not be a good decision to directly approach that person, because there is that formality in that relationship that we don't want to sacrifice. But if it's your partner and they do something that angers you, you want to have that conversation and really try to clear things out instead of sitting in resentment and trying to see if that pattern just stops by itself.
And what, I know we are slightly steering off the topic, but what if the partner is the person who is unwilling to go into conversations? And, you know, I've experienced people saying like, oh no, you're imagining, or, you know, it's nothing happened, and why you're dramatizing things. Like what to do in that situation when your emotions are not validated?
Yeah, you're coming up with some really good questions, and I think it's really applicable here. So what you did mention are ways to gaslight a person, where we start to believe our reality is what the other person's saying. Oh, maybe I was just imagining them saying this, or maybe they actually didn't say what I thought they said. But instead of trying to doubt ourselves and our experience, it's really good to just understand how that experience left us feeling, rather than just nitpick the entire situation. So if a person says, no, that's not true, you're being overly sensitive, it's important to redirect them and say, well, what I'm feeling is true. It's valid. What I'm feeling, it makes sense to me. And I would really appreciate if we can have a conversation about it, rather than, you pushing things away, because I want us to be better. Trying to convert the conversation into a collaborative experience can be really nice. And if you have a partner who's avoidant and they don't like to have these difficult conversations, then it's really helpful to approach them and ask them if they want to have that conversation now, and tell them why it's important to you. So, hey, I'm just wondering, if you have some time right now. I'd love to share what happened through my perspective with you. And I also want to listen to yours, because maybe there was a misunderstanding. You want to have these conversations, because avoidance just doesn't help here.
Meanwhile, I do want to ask the reverse question, because, and I might remember things wrongly nowadays, but it was 25 years at least ago. I had a boyfriend who was the opposite. He needed to discuss every single breath and look and words, and I was getting so exhausted because it didn't really seem to make much sense to me anymore. What do you do? Like, where is there a limit to having conversations, or if you feel like it, you have to have it?
I think there's absolutely limits, especially for someone who's highly sensitive or has an anxious attachment style. We have to recognize our own weaknesses as well. I think that's part of, self-growth and self-development, really understanding what are things that I do in my relationships that maybe sabotage them, right? So if you are someone who maybe gets sensitive about things in the environment quite a lot. So for me, I am someone who's very sensitive, like news, anything really impacts me emotionally. So I have to set boundaries around those things. But if you're someone like that, you also might get really triggered about things that maybe were not as important. And it's your job to evaluate and pick your battles. It's very important to not stress the other person out who's willing to have these conversations with you by overbearing them with these conversations, because they're not fun to have. No one enjoys having these difficult conversations. So it's important to pick your battles and really evaluate, okay, we already had a conversation about this, so maybe I can take a step back and just observe for this time and let it go.
Mm-hmm. I think that was helpful. And we do have Teresa here to join us. Teresa, if you're ready, I would be happy to see you and to hear you both. Okay, here we go. Hi, Teresa.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, it's Teresa. Thanks for having me on.
Teresa.
So I'm an empath, and I'm also a psychic medium. So I read people for a living, and I'm like a sponge with emotions, and I find it sometimes difficult when I have a lot of big emotions myself, and I'm processing these, and then I also have sort of like the emotional state of being of other people that I'm interacting with. So it can be a lot for me to deal with. my tools are journaling and sometimes art, but sometimes I'm just sitting in a lot of emotions. The biggest thing for me is my husband like just had a huge health crisis, and we have these neighbors that he gets along with and I don't, and he's hanging out with them, and I feel so uncomfortable to like even just go out front of my house and be in my own sort of space in my backyard because they're like right beside us.
Mhm.
And he's like best friends with one of them, and I'm like, he's telling everyone, like his best friend, everything about me that he doesn't like. And so I can feel like how that person feels about me. I try to be, use the that naughty word that we're taught on Mind Valley, the unfuckwithable one. But I just feel like I need some tools to deal with these feelings of being left out, not feeling comfortable.
Mhm.
It's a lot.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot. That sounds like a tough situation to be in because it's in your home, really, right? It's in your safe space. So I think what I would suggest is, do you want to feel connected to these people? Because there's definitely something that you're feeling that makes you feel maybe resentful, like whatever it is you're feeling, what you want to be able to name that and then see, what do you actually want from the situation? Why are you not okay with them just getting along and you not being around them because you, like you said, you don't really like them. So what's happening there?
Well, like I want to like I'm a entrepreneur. I'm, wanting to focus on growth while still wanting community. I find like they just talk about like useless topics. I feel like I'm wasting a portion of my life when I'm hanging out with them. I just don't resonate with
Mhm.
them. They're not my people. I don't know if that makes sense. Like I don't want to, I feel I have a lot of high anxiety when I'm hanging around with them. So like that tells me that my soul is not resonating with them. But then again, like they're in our neighborhood, our kids are playing together. I should be less judgmental. I feel like I'm being like a spiritual narcissist. I don't know. I don't know how to deal with these feelings.
Yeah, I think this is just a very tough situation to be in because it's hard to avoid. If your husband, if your partner and kids are very involved in this situation, then it's hard to step away from it. So I feel like in this case, you really just have to implement certain boundaries where it's like you're sort of picking your battles. So you're picking the time that you're spending with them. Like, okay, I will show up and it's a waste of my time. It's not fun for me, but I'll show up every once in a while, say hello, be polite. But at the same time, I'm going to keep my distance because this leaves me feeling anxious and it's not really the best for me either. You can be selfish in these situations, be civil, but be selfish because if it's leaving you feeling drained of energy and just generally you're feeling anxious around them, then it's probably not the best relationship to be in and it doesn't serve you in any way, but it serves your family. So it's a very tough situation to be in, and I think that boundary setting would be important here, like really understanding how much time you can spend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like what someone said in the chat. Tell your husband to stop talking smack about you. Yeah, it's really awkward when like his best friend is like our right beside us neighbor, and I interact with him. Yeah, it's hard. But yeah, I will definitely do that. Have some healthy boundaries and give myself permission to do something else. And it's just dealing with the feelings of like betrayal of him and feeling left out, and I'm just gonna focus more on growth opportunities, I guess, or host my own thing, I guess. It's just
Yeah,
insert eye roll here, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely a very tough situation to be in.
Yeah, I was going to share a couple of tools that I use for emotional regulation for me as an empath, if anybody wants to hear. I do visualization techniques where I visualize mirrors either like a body glove around me. So I'll pull my energy in toward myself so that it's not like out there intertangling with everybody else. I call that dirty bathwater syndrome, where people are like getting in my energy field and like junking it up with all their like stuff. So I pull my energy in, and then I visualize mirrors around me, either on the outside of my bubble or with somebody else that's really bothering me. I'll sometimes visualize with love mirrors on the inside of their aura bubble. It looks like a big egg around the body. And then that keeps their energy like, boom, they become more self-aware of how possibly annoying that they're being. So mirrors are amazing. And then sometimes I'll just like with the breathing technique, I'll visualize a warm, white, loving light washing through me, like through my whole body. And then sometimes I'll place my hand on my heart and on my womb area and take deep breaths and sort of think about things that make me feel really happy, like eating chocolate or slipping into a warm bath or snuggling a puppy, things that sort of trigger that dopamine response in my brain. And I'll try to make that feeling grow. So that's a good one when I'm feeling like really anxious and I can't really do anything about it at that moment.
Teresa, thank you very much. I would like to give a chance to someone else also to ask a question. So thank you for joining us and asking such a personal question and such an open question and honest question. Bianca, if we have someone else who's willing to join us, that would be great. And I do want to ask a question on the in the wind of the previous question. I guess what made me think about that was the idea that we sometimes feel other people's emotions, or we think that we feel. And the situation that Teresa just described is probably quite relatable to a lot of people, maybe not necessarily with someone so dear as a husband or a partner, but we often feel, or at least I say that to myself, oh, I don't like this person because that person doesn't like me. How true or honest this kind of scenario really is? Can we truly know what another person feels about us? Is it okay to make such assumptions, or is it the place where you really need to go and have a conversation before you make any conclusions and actually form your reaction to that person based on what you think they feel?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the example you gave is classic example for projection. If we don't think someone likes us, we're just going to say, yeah, I don't really like that person. It just makes us feel a little bit better. And I think here again, if something to consider is that we have a pattern of cognitive distortions that is common in all humans. And one of the biggest cognitive distortions, which is unhelpful thought pattern that we have, is called mind reading. So we assume just because maybe someone is sitting there and frowning, they are thinking about us and they don't like us. But they might be having a really bad day and they might just be frowning because, they're thinking about something that happened in their day. It's a very difficult thing to assume that this person feels a certain way about us or thinks a certain way about us unless you directly ask them. So if you have the opportunity to do so, it is very important to try to play out the relationship and see, okay, are there any positive things this person's doing with me, or am I only focusing on the negatives? Can I directly ask this person if they have any resentment against me? So these things are very important. And I think the first thing that you mentioned about really, if someone else is feeling anxious around you and you're an empath, you start to feel anxious as well. You have to learn to separate your feelings from theirs. So one way to say is to actually be like, okay, this person is feeling anxious and it's making me a little bit anxious, but this feeling will pass and I can take care of them if I can actually separate the feeling that I'm feeling because of them. It's really important to separate that as an empath so it doesn't affect you completely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We do have Simi here, although I do have a follow-up question, but I will let Simi talk because Simi so beautifully joined us. Hi, Simi.
Hi, Simi.
you
Sorry. Hi, Christina. Sorry, it's okay. You can please continue with your question. I can pass.
I'll pass you. I'll pass the microphone to you. Here it is.
Okay. So quick one, Nawal. What about, there's this philosophy where we say that fake it till you make it. So if you're feeling, they say, if you're feeling low, you don't really, you change your body posture, you change your expressions, you don't feel low anymore. You feel better. So, and in a way you start feeling good, just because is that lying to yourself, or is that, I don't know. How do you put that?
That's a great question. And I think I've also applied this mentality of fake it till you make it. And it's usually for things that leave me, that are fear-based. So things that maybe I need to challenge myself to do more of for my own growth, but I feel very fearful or doubtful about myself. So for example, something that, I started doing a couple of years back was workshops. And this was something that was very difficult for me to do, to speak in front of so many people. It was very hard for me because I'd never done it before. And I sort of imagined myself speaking in front of a crowd, and I already felt myself being in that situation and really identifying myself as someone who can do these workshops. And that really helped me feel a little bit more confident. But there is that aspect that if you really start to depend on this fake it till you make it mentality, then you start to have that imposter syndrome kind of seep in, and you won't really believe all the things that you're doing, because you'll start to say, well, I just faked it till I made it, but I don't know if I still made it yet, So it's a balance. I think you have to really understand when you need that to give yourself a boost, but it's not a long-lasting thing that stays with us. And we have to be very cognizant when that turns into imposter syndrome, where we start to feel like we came all the way here because of luck or because of something else, and not actually our hard work.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simi, for your question. Bianca, do we have, I know we have a lot of questions. Do we have someone who wants to join us? I want to give these opportunities because you have a chance to actually ask a very dear question to you of a person who understands emotions. So yes, we'll see who is joining us. Hopefully somebody is joining us. Otherwise we'll be sitting awkwardly in the silence. Yes, we have Faz. I do not know if I'm pronouncing the name properly, but Faz, if you can ask your question, if you can switch on the camera too, but if you don't want, it's fine.
Hi, Christina. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My question was in terms of emotional intelligence, any specific tips that can be given in order to increase them and help us on our way?
Thanks, Faz, for that question, because I did want to ask about emotional intelligence. It was in the description of the of this interview that we'll talk about how to increase it.
Yeah, emotional intelligence, I think, just to give like a general definition of emotional intelligence, is really that we understand what we're feeling. So we're intelligent enough about our emotions that we're able to name it and work through it, but also we're able to understand other people's emotions, or at least non-verbals. So, that's those social cues that we sense in our environment. We want to have a better understanding of that. So when we feel that, oh, this person is feeling frustrated about something I said, we can then respond in a way that serves that relationship rather than sabotages it more. So there are a few tips for emotional intelligence that can be helpful. One of them is increasing self-awareness. And so this means that you know how you feel and how your emotions affect others. So the best way to do this is pausing before you speak. So take some time to process your emotions first, and then respond to it rather than reacting in emotionally driven situations. Another thing is being able to regulate your emotions well. So regulating your emotions involves keeping your emotions and behavior in check according to the demands or the situation. So, you have the skills to calm your nervous system, just like how Teresa mentioned a few skills she uses, everyone has specific skills that they can use to regulate their emotions. And something that I really use is that deep breathing technique. And there's so many deep breathing techniques too, right? So whatever works best for you, you could hold yourself on your chest and abdomen and take deep breaths like that. You could use the square breathing technique. So, just follow 4 seconds and then pause for 4 seconds, then breathe out for 4 seconds, and then pause for 4 seconds. So there's very great, pardon me?
I use the square breathing. Yeah. I like it.
I actually use the square too. It's just so easy. So that's one thing. I think just being able to know what skills you need to regulate your emotions. And then one other tip is really understanding what inspires you, what motivates you, what your values are. So instead of trying to find positive emotions, positive experiences, or just passion through things that you think are probably good, really understanding what you need, what your values are, allows you to then understand your emotions a little bit better, because you're not in spaces that leave you feeling anxious or not good or that deplete your energy. For example, if you're an introvert, you probably don't like being in highly crowded spaces for too long. And that's because you start to feel overwhelmed. So if you understand that feeling, then you can approach these situations and be like, okay, I'm going to go to this social gathering, but at 9 p.m. I'm going to leave, and I'm allowed to do that because you don't want to be left feeling overwhelmed. So I think these 3 things are really important to increase emotional intelligence.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for the tips. Just one more question. Is there a time frame in terms of the stop and pause? Because sometimes some situations need longer, and then the other person actually feels like you're ignoring them, even though you've told them that you'll come back to the situation. So is there like a time frame? Like, is it like hours? Is it days? How do you manage that?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think the time frame varies from individual to individual, but the average amount of time for us to really not act impulsively are those 90 seconds, because that's the point where we're completely helpless. So when we feel emotionally reactive, there is that part of the brain that shuts down, and that's the part of the brain that allows us to think more rationally, to reason more realistically. If we can't do that, we're just going to react. But allow yourself that 90-second space. But if a situation's really intense and you need more time, allow yourself more time. So, and try to do that in a way, because the justification for it should be that once I have time to process it, I can come back to this relationship, to this situation in a much, much more better way for both of the parties. It's not just for you, it's also the way you approach them. Maybe there's less contempt, there's less hate, there's less anger, right? So if someone else needs to talk right away and you're someone who's like, okay, I need some time to process this, have a conversation. And maybe it's something to have a conversation about just in general, like, hey, when we get into a conflict, I'm someone who needs space to process things. And I'd really appreciate if I can have that space, but know that I love you and I'm going to come back to the conversation and we're going to talk about it. I just need that time. And if a person really wants to know exactly when, give them a time frame. Say, I feel really upset right now. I'd love to have this conversation later, but I need some time to process it. Let's talk about it tomorrow in the evening after work. And that gives them sort of a sense of security that, okay, you know what, we're going to come back to it. I don't have to think about it until then.
Mm. Thank you so much, Faz, for your wonderful questions, very useful questions. And unfortunately, we are at this time in our conversation where we have to round it up. And it's really unfortunate because I see so many questions have come in and it's such a great topic. And unfortunately, nobody teaches us how to deal with that. So we have to figure it out as we go. Traditionally, I want to ask people to leave a heart for my wonderful guest in the comments. And if you're watching it later, somewhere in the recording, you can leave the heart under the video. And, I think the last question I would like to ask is probably a little bit cheesy, but is there like one little tip you could leave us all with? Because we had such an interesting, deep conversation in many directions and a lot of good tips and ideas. But one thing to remember to take out of this conversation.
Yeah, something that I always remind myself of is that not all my thoughts are true. So this is a tip that I'd give you guys. Not all your thoughts are true. And understanding that the reason why it's important is because we know that there's a loop. If we think a certain way, we're going to feel a certain way, and then we're going to act a certain way. So if we can change the untrue, the unhelpful thought, that can help us feel better. And so we show up in the world a lot better than if we were to sit in a thought that was unhelpful and not true. So really evaluate your thoughts, because sometimes our brain tricks us.
True, and I think it tries to do that more than we like to admit. Nawal, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all the guests. Yes, I have to finish. I'm just checking the time. Thank you all the guests for joining us, for leaving your questions, for joining us in the interview, and for leaving your comments and hearts. Unfortunately, my eyesight doesn't allow me to see the comments, but I can see the hearts, so thank you for them. And yes, it was a very interesting and very pleasant conversation, and I hope to see you in a week. Maybe you, Nawal, I do not know. We'll see, but maybe we'll see again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure speaking to you guys. And I hope you guys took something away from this conversation.
It was very, very useful, and you have such a wonderful, pleasant energy. It's been therapeutic. God, I can never pronounce this word, but it was really, really healthy just to talk to you. So thank you so much for that.
I'm so glad. You're so welcome.
Everyone, have a good day, and bye-bye.